I'm going to get started and give you a little bit of a sense of the agenda for today. I'm going to take about, I think, 30 to 45 minutes with this presentation. Yeah, Samantha says in chat, it's definitely time for late lunch. No one needs to see that. In chat, I'm putting a presentation agenda. We'll spend about 10 minutes in breakouts up front, and we'll talk about what's the time you've seen your role in FSL or in civic engagement generally when dialogue may have been useful for civic learning and democratic engagement. I'll give a brief background on sustained dialogue. For instance, what is dialogue, when to use it. We're going to give some time brainstorming dialogue structures on your campus, hopefully to answer that question in breakouts that we've talked about. I'm going to give you this overwhelming resource that you've never wanted a day in your life, created by the National Coalition of Dialogue and Deliberation. It's called the engagement stream. So if you ever forget any of the content from today, there is a link and a guide to bring you to exactly what we're talking about, which is how to find a dialogue program started on your campus and use it in the ways that are effective. And then we'll take any lingering questions about structuring dialogue programs. A quick note is I'll try to read anything from the chat, but feel free to start to get comfortable and let me know if any reason you can't be in a breakout, though I know this group may engage generally. Mike, I can build random breakouts or you could build it on your side for this question, but I want to get us started and have us come back at about 15 after the hour, depending on where you are. When have you seen a time when dialogue may have been useful for civic learning and democratic engagement? And there's no wrong answer. Pairs would be great, but any group size is fine. Welcome back. We are going to move through some slides soon, but I'd love to hear from 2 or 3 people, something that maybe came up for you in the chat that you just had for 10 minutes. I understand that your stories of your schools and moments when you might have needed dialogue towards civic learning, democratic engagement might be a little sensitive. So you don't have to say that. We are being recorded. But if there's something that came up that you wanted to share with the others, I'd love to hear any reflections that came up from maybe 2 or 3 folks. Yeah, is that Gleanne?
Yeah, it's Gleanne. I was talking with Jacqueline and, I'm at an institution, a liberal arts institution, and we talk a lot about dialoguing across difference. And one thing that's come up that I think I've seen, not just at my institution, but at others, is that I think students are willing to dialogue across difference when it comes to like formal programs and when they're dialoguing across like intellectual, theories and things that they're talking through in the classroom. But when it comes to issues like in informal settings or in their social environments, it's a little bit harder for them to engage in that dialogue or seek out that difference because they have their, social circles that they're set, they find people who are similar to them. And so having that dialogue in informal, like social settings has been often the challenge that I've seen as I'm working with students, where they're willing to engage and have that, dissensus in an intellectual, academic setting, but outside of that, it's more challenging for them.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gleanne. And Caitlin says the reflections around Roe v. Wade from a medical perspective, that's come up in almost every call I've had about just gender in general in the last months.
Yeah, following Glenn, in our case, we are also a liberal arts institution, and we have several programs within our campuses, but in the case of our department, we try to involve students in deep dialogues, and we have created like the Intergroup Dialogue Voices program. We have invited some institutions that can give a different perspective from the ones that they might have. Last year, we invited Braver Angels that for some ones were quite controversial, but it worked because offered, within the umbrella, other ways that they can compare and choose and pick as they feel. And this year we're inviting Emergent Strategy Ideation Institute as well. And we try to partner and collaborate with other units with our campuses, like the Center for Leadership and Democracy. We are really focused on, our platform is social justice and human rights dialogue, continuing dialogue for social justice and human rights. And our approach these last 3 years is being focused on social justice leadership. That's what we're working about right now.
That is so far beyond the curve of what most people are doing that you may have to put in chat some of the organizations that you've engaged. You could probably lead this session on how you make those choices. And actually what I'm going to be talking about today is I live in one dialogue organization, but I'm going to try to get you literally to the point that Jacqueline's in, which is how to make sure that you're as familiar with who to engage when, so that you can deploy what you want towards your goals. That's the goal. And so I'm really glad to hear that you've been kind of using the shopping part of all these different methodologies and groups to get to your goals of social justice leadership and other goals. That's great to hear.
Thank you.
And then in chat from Carnegie Mellon, we have NPHC and MGC response to civic engagement is more encompassing than IFC and Panhellenic. Yes, that is a trend that we see nationally, some deep nods around the room. Everything can shift from place to place, but we do see this as a national trend. So let's talk a little bit and get to the meat and potatoes here, because all of what you've said is pretty stimulating and I don't want to get distracted. So I'll share for about 10 or so minutes before I open it back up for us to chat. And yeah, thank you for sharing your website as a reference. I should have known it's Miami of Ohio. Thank you. Where we're going to start is a definition of dialogue. And I apologize if you've seen this before. There's not a presentation I do that doesn't start with what is dialogue. Especially if you came up in maybe a higher ed affairs program or a student affairs program, you may have heard the phrase, just do a dialogue across difference. If there's trouble, just do a dialogue across difference. I want to let you know, I've been at my organization for the last 14 years. The Sustained Dialogue Institute is an organization that says, look, we are more on the far end of you do not have to do a dialogue across difference if the conditions aren't such that permit it. And so to begin today, I want to start with this definition. I would love to hear, is there anybody who doesn't mind reading this definition out loud? And I'll give you these slides so you can have everything that I talk about today. I have a volunteer just to read this definition, the full paragraph.
I can.
Yes, who's that? Feel free to share. Yeah, is that Chelsea?
Chelsea, yes.
Perfect.
Dialogue is a process of genuine interaction through which human beings listen to each other deeply enough to be changed by what they learn. Each makes a serious effort to take others' concerns into their own picture, even when disagreement persists. No participant gives up their identity, but each recognizes enough of the other's valid human claims so that they will act differently toward the other.
Thank you, Chelsea. I'll leave this up, though. Again, I'll share these slides with you. I'd love to hear a few responses for, does this match kind of what you think of when you think of the word dialogue? What do you like or what stands out to you about this definition? I'd love to hear from you.
The thing that stands out for me on this is the statement changed by what we learn. But also if you go down a little bit further where it says you don't give up your identity, but you can still be changed by what you learn. And that's what I appreciate stands out for me the most.
Thank you, Christopher. Anyone else?
Yeah, similarly, at the end when it says that they'll act differently, that there is like a productive conversation that results in something.
Yeah, Sarah, you've illuminated you've both illuminated some really key aspects here. I want to let you know that first off, nobody says this, but I'm comfortable saying it. Dialogue does not always work. For For those of you who've studied intergroup contact or social contact theory, there's this idea that if we just stick everybody together and they spend hours together, it'll work. But actually, Allport, who published social contact theory, he had some serious parameters for when to expect that social contact works. They actually mirror the guidelines we teach at the Sustained Dialogue Institute. And I want to tell you some of the ways that dialogue has worked best. Number one, this may be counterintuitive. When everyone is actually interested in what you see on the slide, the quality of dialogue goes up significantly. So the first rule is opt in. Creating dialogue with people who don't want to be there is like creating an assembly for an 8th grade classroom. The possibilities really shift when people truly want to be in that room. Second, just like Sarah alluded to, there does have to be the prospect of productive change, unless you want to violate some serious principles around power and how groups relate. More specifically, you can easily create a dialogue that is not socially just, meaning you're putting people up against another group that won't fundamentally respect their dignity. We always want to avoid sticking groups together and just assuming dialogue will do magic. That's number one. And I only say this because so much of my work is just telling people those two things. Oh, that works a lot better when people want to be there. Oh, you really need to consider that without clear goals for why we're coming together. For instance, we're going to do some civic learning and democratic engagement here. That's why we're here. We're learning about how to interact with all others. You can really do a lot of harm through dialogue. And I know that it's often not talked about it, but our organization, out of every dialogue organization, is probably on the more let's do no harm approach. It's better to lead no dialogue than just to think a dialogue's a magical tool. Nothing's a magical tool. So I wanted to start us there, just in case you're from a place where it's always like, just do a dialogue. Whoa, you should really think about what that means. And a quick introduction, just because our name is Sustained Dialogue, I do want to clarify that lowercase d dialogue it's a distinctive way of communicating. It can be used formally or informally. So if I just start sharing my experiences with, for instance, our experiences in the last year around times that needed dialogue, we'd likely start an informal dialogue. A formal dialogue may be needed in other cases, and that may include an application to be there, which might sound strange to you, but imagine how tense some difficult dialogues get. They may require structures and places, literally asking people, what experience have you had with talking about this topic with others? Where would you see yourself on this spectrum? Those are the types of moments that would require formal dialogue. And formal dialogue may represent like a peace process, might go as long as in our process, 10 meetings or 12 meetings. The second point on the slide says there are a variety of formal dialogue processes. Jacqueline has been generous to name some of the people who share those with campuses. So Braver Angels, Intergroup Dialogue, Sustained Dialogue. They all have different emphases and agreed upon components. There's no wrong answer. They're just useful for different things. So for instance, we're known as a more social justice one, meaning that we're likely going to teach you in depth how to work across power and facilitate across power. We don't directly facilitate for the most part. We train students to do it. Intergroup dialogue is known to be more often in classrooms for credit, but it isn't always such, as Jacqueline just shared with us. And Braver Angels is known as a bit more red-blue, but includes lots of other identities. So there's different thrusts and emphases of any dialogue process. We're just one of many. And so I'm actually not here in my capacity as a person who works at the Sustained Dialogue Institute. I actually don't care which dialogue process you use. I just want you to use the right one for what you're looking at. The slide says this one focuses on building relationships and taking action. We're going to jump into some of the needs that people throw around and bat around the word dialogue for. And I'm going to try to give you the vocab that I think most people want when they're trying to approach particular issues. And so this slide has a lot of information on it. If you're joining by phone, I'm going to make sure I read this aloud. This slide is labeled as structures and campus need examples. So the first campus need is often, and this is not just something I've mentioned because of many of your affiliations with fraternity and sorority life, though many of you know that you're often in a response role. So for the need of responding to a specific incident that has harmed the community and specific individuals, often the phrase of which type of dialogue process you're needing, it's restorative justice conferencing. That is one shape with agreed upon components, and often from the Sustained Dialogue Institute. I'm trained as a restorative justice conference person, so I might have to say, oh, this doesn't need a one-time dialogue. This doesn't need a multi-dialogue process. This simply needs a restorative justice conferencing. The invites look different. The length of time we're gathering looks different. Whether or not we can do it by Zoom, whether it has 4 people or 400 people, all of those things are specific. That's one example of like the right process to use for that. Restorative justice conferencing is particular because some of the agreed upon components involve naming harms, being able to name harms, having a circle process that may take up to like 2 to 4 hours. And many people don't know that that's within the dialogue circle process world. And another key aspect of restorative justice is actually having sometimes the perpetrators in the room, though it's not mandated as a part of the process. The next point says, say there's a need around improving or repairing relationships between groups on campus. Likely you want to think about ongoing dialogue groups. We've all been at a town hall or a one-time meeting that simply started to make progress right in that 5 minutes before the end of that town hall. Ongoing dialogue groups are quite a lift up front. But for instance, our entire org is structured around how to get the know-how to lead an ongoing dialogue group, so it's less of a structural lift. There's some progress that can only be made over time when it comes to changing relationships. And this says, I actually want to get to know the people on the other side of this. And we'll talk some examples about what this might look like later. For the next need listed here, it says provide opportunities for campus or community feedback on specific issues or policy decisions. This is where we're at those standalone campus or community forums. They're wonderful for engaging the community. And they don't require relationship building. So they can be done that one day. This could look a lot like a focus group in other contexts, and that's something important. Say there's a need for a relatively quick weight of potential policy options in coming to a decision within a community. For those of you who are less familiar with the process of deliberative forums, they're taught by organizations like the National Issues Forum. And don't worry, I'll have this all written down for you in a bit. A chance to weigh potential options and name and frame solutions that are specific and don't need a lot of dialogue or relationship building up front. That might be a standalone deliberative forum. And if you Google deliberative forum, you'll find tons of ways that's being taught and executed in higher ed. And for many of you, this is where you live all the time. The next one says increase civic education opportunities for students. Ongoing curricular or co-curricular dialogue or deliberation programs, they'll both increase civic learning over time in a big substantial way. And they've got some wonderful proving outcomes like the Wake Forest study, which shows that just this ongoing exposure to dialogue and deliberation has some real outcomes in terms of civic learning. And there's some studies that prove that I'm happy to share with you. And then finally, the last point on the slide says, provide leaders with skills for having better conversations within their respective areas. That's dialogue skills training and opportunities to practice. Just a quick civic timeline of my participation in dialogue programs. My first year, I joined a Sustained Dialogue group as a participant. It was a dialogue group about race, and I had no interest in civic learning, democratic outcomes. I just wanted to talk and be heard about race. When I trained to be a facilitator and I was trained in how to lead these groups, the civic learning began. So I had to realize, oh, to get people there, I have to be able to speak to different communities about the needs and the importance here. I can't just yell, race is really important. You should come to my dialogue group. That would be weird. And then I also had this second level, higher level learning, even about the topics that I was interested in. So previously, as a person who cared a lot about race and racial oppression, I wasn't used to being in dialogue with other people who might have similar racial backgrounds who didn't care as much. Dialogue and training how to facilitate dialogue usually teaches people that you're going to encounter all types, even people who look and sound just like you, who do not care as much about the thing that you do. And so that's some of how that civic learning and democratic engagement and that practice over time is really important. So if you've been providing these things to your students as options, kudos to you, but this is a lot in addition to what you're already doing. I mentioned early on as we started this recording, I mentioned that I was going to give you a resource that no one wants because it's so comprehensive. I want you to know that the slide we're on is the simple version of this guide, but now I'm going to welcome you into the National Coalition of Dialogue and Deliberation, the engagement streams. So I'm going to pause a bit and give you the link in front of us so that you can get a sense of the comprehensive guide that the dialogue and deliberation world made literally for an audience just like you all. Feel free to download this. And I'm going to tell you what you're looking at. Quite a few years ago, this was built, I believe, at first in 2014. Somebody said, there's too many dialogue and deliberation things. No one knows how to use them all. Somebody needs to write a checklist guide about when to use what. This is that guide. So they call it the engagement streams. And if you look, the key thing I want to point you to is starting from like pages 4 through 6 in this document. And I want to give you a time just to look at pages 4 through 6. So feel free to take just like 5 minutes just to read through any of this that seems interesting to you until 42 after. All right, now nobody's ever going to ask you, hey, I need you to pull out every dialogue stream that's possible. Let's think together on the right approach. But I want you to have that deep knowledge of where these processes differ. On the page 7, the lower right-hand corner, page 7 of that document, you'll see that they have these differentiated into 4 categories. And there's also a really big cartoon in that document later that shares some are for exploration, some are for decision-making, some are for conflict transformation, and some are for getting to action and next steps and collaborative group-making processes. I would say the only thing that's really helpful to know from your role is just the process of saying, wait, I have this many people and I'm trying to get to conflict resolution. I might need X. I have 200 people. I can't do Y. That process isn't best suited for it. And those proven streams can be really useful if you're just aware of how many options you have within your role. With that said, I want to share 2 examples of how to use dialogue that I've seen within fraternity sorority life, and then turn it over for any questions right around in the next 2 minutes. So because we're being recorded, I can't share about what the name of the first school is. It's a small North Carolina campus that was dealing within fraternity life in particular across IFC with transphobia in response to a specific transphobic fraternity incident. You may have already figured out, ooh, that sounds like a disciplinary process on one side, maybe a restorative justice conferencing, and that's exactly what the campus did. But in addition, they had some third-party community ripples within fraternity life where students were saying, look, we need the staff to lead us in an ongoing dialogue about gender and who we are and how to deal with and combat transphobia. Students requested it, and the staff were gracious enough to learn and train up about how to use dialogue and lead it for their students. This was only a process for less than 15 people, because that's the audience of people who actually wanted to participate. The outcomes of that were that this group created some new policies within each of their fraternities. No one knows where they came from, but it actually came from this multi-meeting facilitated dialogue group process that no one knew existed later because it was organized ad hoc. People trained up to do it one time, and then they implemented the solutions that came out of it. So no one needed to brand it or recruit for it. It just kind of happened, which is an ideal way to use dialogue. It doesn't have to be a full-time ongoing program. At the same time, there are programs that become full-time parts of fraternity sorority life. So at Case Western Reserve University, they've been working, and some of you may be from there. Feel free to let me know. Some students who had been trained in sustained dialogue, we teach them how to facilitate. So naturally, they start to look at where they live and where they spend their time. These students, one was within fraternity life and one within sorority life, launched an ad hoc one-time program within their sorority and fraternities as a natural extension of their interests and skills. That was I know that I care about the sorority. I'm already trained in how to lead difficult dialogue. I kind of want to talk about this topic with my people. How do I do that? Oh, they kind of taught me how to do it already. That's not something an advisor needed to manage or a director needed to set up a separate budget for. They just kind of set aside some meetings within a particular sorority. And then there's this old quintessential example, Northwestern University in 2005, I believe. They had a Bridging the Gap retreat, which is the kickoff retreat that they had. It's changed its name, I'm sure 15 times by now. Students had this unique racial dialogue across lines of councils that they hadn't seen happen previously. And this dialogue was so engrossing that almost everyone who went to this retreat was like, we need to continue this conversation. That was both within fraternity life and sorority life. So they sought training for themselves. They told someone like you, we'd like to continue the conversation and we think we could facilitate it. The person like you on the other side of that just said, okay, I think it's maybe sustained dialogue would be useful to you. You'll get some training. Some people should be moderators. So they sought the training, and then they kept a race dialogue going for at least 2 to 3 years that just started at the retreat and kept on going. And some of the popular topics we do see within FSL include masculinity, gender identity, race. Those are sort of evergreen, but nothing's not important is generally the rule within our work. Everything might be worth talking about if a student proposes it. At this point, you might be surprised. We've moved to questions and answer. There's no more formal presentation slides at this point. It's only making sense of what's useful for you. So I'm hoping you have that feeling of like, oh, okay, I can do whatever I want. It's just about figuring out the right next steps for each organization or each process. So I'd love to hear any questions or thoughts you have. And I want to make, yeah, and if you have to head out, those resources are perpetual. We'll make sure we email the link to the slides. So thank you, Gleanne. Questions, thoughts? How do I do X? Yeah, Jacqueline?
Yeah, I think this approach is really convenient in the sense that you can assess what is the most important strategy to use given a specific context or a condition that you want to address. And sometimes it's hard when you don't have any tools to use, so give you a sense of confidence that you can pick and choose and test the waters and try to figure out how to do that. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Absolutely, yeah, and you've already been building your own map. If I let you continue over time, you'd have developed this yourself.
I hope we can get there.
Others, questions, comments, thoughts? Yeah,
I
Jennifer.
just want to say thank you for this presentation, and that it shows that dialogue is not easy. It's really not easy. And I like how this is broken down into different groups, different perspectives, so that if you want to have one, then you look to see what it is all about so that you can apply the resources that is best to engage in that dialogue, because it's not easy.
Jennifer, I'm so happy you said that. I don't know why. It's very fulfilling for me as a person who really works all the time on difficult dialogue to hear someone say, ah, yeah. I recognize there's a lot that can go into the human aspect of this. So Jennifer, you've got it.
Thanks.
Well, it says very helpful. Thank you for the tool, Rhonda. This will help tremendously moving forward. That's all we ever ask. Sarah says, I don't have any questions. This is helpful and informative. And Chelsea, did I see you go off mute?
Yes. I guess I'm curious, how have you found ways to, or what have you seen has been successful to like thread that needle? Because I agree, you don't want to bring someone in who doesn't want to be in that space. But sometimes I feel like students also don't know what they don't know, so they don't know what to ask for. Like, I feel like a lot of the examples you gave, students like had something that kind of piqued them and they were like, wait a minute, let's keep this up. What if there's a student who's like, everything's wrong and I don't know what to do? It's like, I know dialogue would be great, but how do I like invite them into that space, I guess?
I'm going to give the full academic answer. I'm so sorry that I can't just say, just try it. Only because the groups that are most vulnerable are the ones that end up sort of being tricked into like, oh man, I thought this was going to be a different space. The simplest way I can think about this is whenever you hear someone say, the people who need to be here aren't here, try to think about, all right, have the people who want to be, like, are the people who sometimes get called the choir who might be willing to talk, do they have enough spaces to talk without somebody insulting them or questioning their humanity? That's all I want you to think about as you're building spaces. It is wonderful to bring people who are exploring how much they care about things. But one best practice that we teach within our initiative that may be different from others, separate out your educational opportunities and your dialogue opportunities. So for instance, this is controversial. Book club, don't do a dialogue every week after the book club. Just let them go think on their own, get to the end of the book when we're educated more, and then say, hey, would you ever want to be in dialogue with others about this? That is super controversial for some people because education and dialogue get used interchangeably. But one best practice is to always educate and make it clear the goal of this space is education, and then separate out when the exploration through dialogue begins. And then you just don't make sure that just keeps you from putting someone who's vulnerable in with someone who's going to say very hateful things that they can never take back. Especially in this age of like social media, it's even beneficial for the person who's learning not to be learning in front of other people and speaking immediately. The element of reflection and deep inquiry can be done really privately before putting people together. And so one tool that we have is we'll separate out and say, hey, for those of you who are here to explore, this first 45 minutes is for you. For those who really want to make sure that you're talking, here are the ground rules that begin at this point. 45 minutes in, here's what we're going to do to make sure we respect everyone's humanity fully here. This will be different from the educational time we had before. And that may feel like too prescribed, but it can be really helpful at not making things worse. So if there's an educational opportunity, advertise it as such, get that population, but don't throw them in with the people who are at risk of being, having their dignity and fundamental humanity questioned.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, there's this very US thing of like, just throw everybody in together. That's how everyone learns together, which is like, sometimes we'll plan and collaborate better without the people who hate us there. Sometimes we may need educational opportunities that don't involve democratic engagement, which is so weird to say, but it's true. They can go better separate sometimes. All right, I want to begin to slowly wrap this up, and thank you for the organizers and all the part of the multiple knowledge committee organizers and leaders who are here, and everybody who's participating. If you ever have a question, yes, we're the Sustained Dialogue Institute, but we're also trained, for instance, I'm trained in Intergroup Dialogue, Essential Partners, Public Conversations Project Model, which is called Respective Structured Dialogue. And most of us are all friends with each other at the dialogue orgs. So we'll actually point you to the others if you ask us, what do I do? Most of us are structured as nonprofits, and we joke at the Sustained Dialogue Institute, you can call us 16 times and get trained. And virtually, like, it's only down to 12 hours because we don't have to break for lunch. That might sound like a lot of training, but many of the campuses we use figure out time and ways to distribute that kind of thing over time. And so if you have something in mind and you're just like, wait, I don't want to read all these engagement streams, like, can you just tell me what to do? I'll give you my best sense of it without telling you, you should definitely use Sustained Dialogue. Because honestly, most of the time I pick up the phone, I'm like, oh, that's definitely not Sustained Dialogue. It's way too much work for what you're trying to do. So feel free to reach out to us. We'll always try to get you on the path of where you can have the most impact with the least hours expended from busy people like you. With that said, thank you for your time today. I hope to see you doing something wonderful. Otherwise, keep carrying out your wonderful work.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Bye-bye.
Amazing. Thanks,
Thank you all
Rhonda.
for coming. We really appreciate it.